What? Do I have something on my face? Every series has what I like to call the elephant. You know, the proverbial elephant in the room. The one aspect of itself that it will never, ever actually address, no matter how close to it gets, because for various reasons. For example, for all of its talks about war and peace, the Naruto series deftly avoids ever talking about one specific thing, namely the fact that this is a society built on child soldiers. Sure, it gets dangerously close to occasionally mentioning it, to when they talk about how the battlefield is horrible and how conditions are bad, but they never actually address the fact that this is an amoral situation that even at its best is still sending kids to die. Even at the end of the series, when Naruto wins and becomes Hokage, spoilers, his so-called better world still employs child soldiers, and no one seems to have a problem with that. And I honestly don't have a problem with that either. This is a general conceit of fiction. There are just certain things you can't try to cover because otherwise your entire premise falls apart. In the case of Naruto, if the series were to investigate the morality of child soldier programs, it would make the entire ending more pointless than it already is, and well, you can't have that. So don't read this as me saying that, oh, every series is bad because it doesn't answer every single question. Certain questions you just cannot talk about because they ruin the whole point of your series, and well, I can respect not wanting to do that. However, sometimes the elephant a series chooses to be the elephant is a bit weird, and it sometimes falls onto topics and ideas that I think should actually be discussed in that series. I wonder if there is a series that we could talk about, one that I am very knowledgeable on and notoriously, infamously invested in, but I really can't think of any. Anyway, the My Hero Academia timeline is really fucking weird. Yeah, so in Korei Horikoshi's My Hero Academia, the proverbial elephant is, well, the timeline of events, which should already trigger some alarm bells. However, it's not really that bad because the actual timeline of the series events is pretty straightforward. Once you understand how the weird Japanese school system works, you know when these characters go to school, when they have holidays, and when they return to school again, and that more or less works. You have occasional reminders when a month starts and when a month ends, and that's good enough. That is not the problem. But once you try looking into the past, this series gets very funky. For a series whose many problems really deal with the idea of the past and passing on the torch to the future, it really does not actually spend a lot of time telling you about the past, instead being incredibly ambiguous about the things that happened before, and especially about when they happened. So, because I am forever invested into trying to squeeze as much value out of this series as possible, I thought today we could make the harrowing and difficult journey of trying to make a definitive My Hero Academia past timeline. So yeah, strap in, this one will be fun. So, for starters, let's review the actual things the series directly tells us about the past. Long ago, quirks appeared. That's it. That's about as accurate as it ever precisely gets. Deku never really specifies anything in this opening narration, and even later when we get the narration repeated, we never actually get additional details. However, there are a couple of interesting tidbits, especially in the first couple of chapters of My Hero, namely that they keep talking about generations, quirk generations that is. When Deku and his mom visit Dr. Totally Not Garaki, why would you think that? He mentions that she is a 4th gen quirk user, which would mean that Deku and his people are the 5th generations of quirk users. You'd think that this would be the definitive answer to a timeline, right? Because a generation is actually very easily definable. According to international census data, a generation is defined as the time span within which a single group of kids grows up and becomes ready to make their own kids, which is defined as around 30 years. So, easy peasy, right? Deku is 5th generation, so we have 4 generations of quirk users before him. So 4 times 30 is 120. Quirks happened 120 years ago. Easy peasy, right? Except there's a small issue with this. The whole thing about generations is actually never explained in that sense, and is very rarely brought up, and it's actually not really present in the story past the first couple of chapters. So while this is a very easy answer, I don't think we can quite take it at face value yet. We should review the other information that we have beforehand. One other thing we can infer about the quirk's emergence is that it was very gradual, and specifically that it was exponential. This is because All Might says that when he was a child, quirklessness was still pretty common. All Might is only in his 50s, which means that the amount of quirks, the density of quirks within the population has risen dramatically in just the last 50 years. This implies an exponential growth curve, which itself then implies to us that there was a pretty long period in which quirks were around but not particularly common. Which makes sense. This period would be where all the civil unrest that we keep hearing about would have happened, because quirks were not yet common enough to be the new normal, but they were there and they were impossible to ignore. Speaking of All Might and his quirk One for All, let's move on from a general narration to things that we can infer from pieces of the plot, namely One for All. Before Deku and excluding him, One for All has had 8 users, all of which held the quirk for a certain amount of time. This makes One for All a very good dating tool to find out how long ago quirks emerged, or at the very least, how long ago All for One and his brother Yoichi emerged. We also actually know a fair bit about the time span that these people held the quirk. For example, we know All Might held it the longest at 40 years. And we also know that the second longest holder was Hikage Shinomori at 18 years. Therefore, we can actually guess the other ones to be less than 18 years. How does that work? However, there is a catch. Namely, Hikage had it for 18 years, but was abruptly stopped when he realized that the quirk was killing him. Or rather, he realized it after dying. This means that 18 years is approximately the time a user can hold One for All without dying, excluding All Might and Deku because they were originally quirkless, and One for All only kills you if you had a quirk beforehand. This means that every other user who isn't All Might or Hikage had the quirk for less than 18 years. However, it also can't have been too short, for one reason. When One for All was born, it was very weak. It basically added no strength to Yoichi, and by the time it got to Hikage, it was still so weak that instead of fighting, Hikage resigned himself to just using his time to train, which means that when he had it, it was still not exactly very refined. This implies that everyone after Hikage had to have had it for a pretty chunky amount of time, because by the time it arrives at All Might's hands, he can create tornadoes and literally fly using kicks. And well, that implies that you need quite a bit of time to do that. So, All Might had it for 40 years, Hikage had it for 18 years. En, Banjo, and Nana would have had it for less than 18 years, but long enough to add a substantial amount of power to it. So let's assume they all had it for 15 years each. That is a good round number, and even though it's probably not particularly accurate, I think at least it will make up for any of our inaccuracies by being nice and even. The first 3 holders, however, present a new problem, because Yoichi, the second and the third user, all lived at the same time and were part of the same revolutionary movement. This limits us in how we can actually make this work, because they can't have had it for too long, because by the time it would have arrived at the third would have already been somewhat old, if we still go by our 15 years rule. Thus, let's assume that Yoichi had the quirk for 5 years. He was already sickly, and I don't think he would have survived much longer with the new quirk. Then let's say the second and the third each had it for 10 years. This will make it so that they all had it for a good amount of time, to the point where they could understand how it actually functions and create this system of passing it on, but they would also not become too old, and also wouldn't have been able to add too much power to the quirk, so that it still was very weak when Hikage got it. And now, if we add all of these together, oh god, math, we end up at 128 years, which, would you know it, actually lines up with our rough estimate of the generation comment we looked at the start. Now, admittedly, this is very wishy-washy because, of course, we don't have a lot of information, and a lot of my estimates are probably actually a bit too long for the quirk users, because, for example, we know that all of them died fairly young, but some of these numbers would have these people at, you know, their mid-40s even, which I think would be a bit too old for them. So it isn't ideal. You could probably reduce the numbers on the second and third user as well, but nonetheless, this is what we're left with. Alright, now that we have seemingly pinpointed when One for All was born as a quirk, we can start looking at how this relates to when quirks as a concept were born. For that, we need to look at the few characters that we have that are from the era when quirks were still new. That is namely Dr. Garaki. Dr. Garaki is mentioned to be, quote, over 120 years old, which is somewhat vague but gives us a range we can work with. Now, the thing that's important to note with him is that his quirk, longevity, doesn't actually keep his appearance up to a certain age, but just slows his aging. This also means that we cannot use his appearance, All for One's appearance, to try and figure out when exactly the quirk transfer happened. We do know, however, that All for One and Garaki teamed up 70 years before the series, when Garaki would have been 50 years old. That means that All for One has only had his longevity quirk for 70 years, which means that before that, he was subject to aging. Now, obviously, we don't know if he had an anti-aging quirk before, but I would assume that if he sought out this doctor specifically and asked to receive his quirk, that there would be a need for that. So I would say that All for One probably teamed up with Garaki once his immediate understanding of his death started setting in. So perhaps he was already quite old at the time. Let's say All for One was himself 70 years old when he first met up with Dr. Garaki, which would make All for One about 140 years old. Now, this lines up again with how One for All the quirk was born. However, we do still need one extra detail, which is how old was the concept of quirks when All for One was born. And well, we know nothing about that. There is nothing in the series that points to that, but this is gonna be pure speculation on my part, but I think All for One was not actually part of the first generation of quirk users because he was already an established boss of the underworld at what seems to have been like 20. When he was very young. So that means that he must have started when he was even younger, which means he must have had an understanding of quirks and how they influence society at a very young age, which would only really be possible if quirks have already existed a bit before he came into the picture. So, I think quirks emerged one or maybe two generations before All for One was born, which would put the quirk emergence at around 180 or 200 years ago. This will be my estimate. Again, this includes a lot of speculation, but this is as good as I can do right now because, dear God, this series does not like giving me easy answers. And so, here we have it. Quirks emerged around 200 years ago. About 150 years ago, All for One was born, and about 120 between 130 years ago, One for All was born. Super easy, right? Everything works out. Except, of course, there is a monkey wrench in all of this. You might have noticed that there's one character with the relation to the past that I have religiously avoided mentioning. This is Redestro. Look at him. Look at this stupid fucking bitch. He is what we, in professional terms, like to call a pain in my ass. Namely because he complicates this pretty tremendously and in a way that is very annoying. Redestro is of course the descendant of the revolutionary Destro. Yes, descendant, not son. I can understand why so many people think that he's his son because both in the manga and the anime, the way that lineage is revealed just says, oh, Destro had a child in the world, and then switches to Redestro, so I can understand why you would think that, but no, he is his distant descendant, and we know that because we do get a small flashback on Redestro where we see him surrounded by various presumed family members saying that they have been hiding for generations, which doesn't work if he's a direct son. And I hope you like this panel because we're gonna look at it for a second, because, yeah. His caretakers, or family members, or whatever they may be, say that Destro's lineage has been in hiding for generations. Now, first of all, generations is plural, which means that already he cannot be his son. So far so good. However, generations is what is called an ambiguous plural, meaning it is a plural that eschews actually saying the exact number of things. This could refer to just 2 generations, making Redestro Destro's grandson. However, the problem is that in English and a lot of other languages, you don't use ambiguous plurals when you refer to 2 things, because if something is only that few, you can just say 2. No, ambiguous plurals implies 3 or more. And you could say, okay, fair enough, that means Destro goes back even further than All for One, perhaps in that middle space between All for One's birth and the quirk emergence 200 years ago. Still works, right? Except, no, because of a single little thing within My Hero Academia's linguistics, of all things. You see, the powers these characters have actually have multiple names assigned to them throughout history. We know them as quirks, and all the modern characters also refer to them as such, but when they first emerged, they were called meta-abilities, and quirk users were called meta-humans. You know, the Meta-Human Liberation Army, for example. This term was only changed after Destro's mother was killed and Destro's uprising was failed, which then led to them renaming the thing to quirks. This is interesting because cool lore, but it is also consistent in the series that every character who came before Destro's revolution would call things meta instead of quirks, whereas everyone after his revolution would call it quirks. For example, All for One and his younger brother Yoichi call them meta abilities, which means that All for One and Yoichi were alive and lived before Destro's uprising. However, the third user of One for All calls them quirks. This means that Destro's uprising happened between the first and the third user. We haven't heard the second user really speak that much yet, so we don't know what word he uses. So, that would mean that the revolution happened in that time frame, but it would also mean that the numbers stop making sense, because as we've established, Destro would have to be quite significantly removed from Redestro. How much removed? Well, he would have to be, at the very least, 3 generations before Redestro's generation, who is himself already quite old. And honestly, I think it would be more than 3 generations, because if it's only 3 generations, you would still say, oh well, it's generations, right? So, that implies that Redestro was 5 or 6 generations ago, which of course doesn't work with this timeline, and I am about to cry. The only way this really works is if we assume that Destro happened 3 generations before Redestro's parents, which would put him roughly in the right spot, but also not great. There's also the detail that Garaki uses quirks, not meta abilities when he talks. So yeah, I am despairing, and I realize that this is a task way beyond my understanding of maths because I failed every math test in existence. But in conclusion, the timeline is fucky. I think quirks happened about 200 years ago, and I will now go cry in a blanket until the bad numbers disappear. Goodbye. Thank you everyone for watching as usual. I hope you enjoyed this new little format I'm trying out. And yes, this is VTuber tech that I'm using. It's actually really interesting and cool. I can talk about it more in maybe like a Q&A or whatever if you're interested. But either way, thank you all for watching. And of course, a big thank you to all our patrons. including Daniel Garcia, Cini, Victor Perez, Cesar Londono, Geo, Ignis, Jameson Tate, Mr. Meander, and Paracha. Thank you all, and I'll see you around. Bye bye, love you.